to change things and to make sure that it would be based on the auto manufacturer to reduce, like they want, EVs, hydrogen, whatever, their basically GHG emissions. And we're aligning ourselves with Europe. It's a first.
Joly has just pulled Canada decisively away from the United States in the most significant automotive policy shift in a generation. In back-to-back public appearances, she made it clear that Canada is finished letting American politics dictate the fate of its manufacturing sector. The new auto strategy is not about fine-tuning old rules. It is about breaking free from a system that has left Canadian workers exposed to the volatility coming out of Washington, especially under President Donald Trump's tariff-first approach. What Joly unveiled this week is the blueprint for an independent industrial era, one where Canada sets its own standards, chooses its own partners, and builds a cleaner, more resilient manufacturing base that does not rely on the White House behaving rationally.
The U.S. can take their own decisions. We will obviously work on having a good deal with them, but there are things we cannot control, and we cannot control what's going on, especially in the White House. The Japanese automakers have been the ones that are actually invested very much in the country. Even since the trade war started, they've increased their production.
Her first announcement landed during a national interview where she confirmed that Canada will replace the EV sales mandate with a new emissions framework aligned with Europe. The tone was unmistakable. She said Canada cannot control what happens in the White House and therefore must build an auto strategy insulated from American political swings. That alone signaled a deep break from decades of regulatory harmony with the U.S. The message grew even stronger during her visit to Guelph, where she described the federal plan to transform the auto sector into a national growth engine. She highlighted new EV rebates, funding for charging infrastructure, and support for manufacturers that commit to producing in Canada. Joly was careful to link these measures to global trends. She pointed to the investments from Toyota, Honda, Volkswagen, LG, and Hyundai as proof that the future of Canada's auto supply chain does not hinge on Detroit or Washington alone. The context reinforces her position. Trump's 25% auto tariffs remain in place. Stellantis moved production to Illinois, stripping thousands of jobs from Ontario. GM shut down BrightDrop. By contrast, Asian and European automakers are ramping up production and hiring across Canadian regions. Together, these moments explain why Canada is now choosing to realign its industrial future away from the United States. For Joly and Prime Minister Mark Carney, the deeper issue is not simply emissions policy, it is sovereignty. Canada cannot be asked to build its economy around the internal political battles of another country. Trump has turned tariffs into a permanent tactic rather than a temporary deterrent, leaving Canada vulnerable every time he threatens a new duty. By aligning with Europe, Canada escapes that trap. It gives the country regulatory freedom and a larger global market to build for. It also reassures automakers that Canada will not shift rules every election cycle. This strategy fits perfectly within Carney's economic doctrine. Canada is strengthening ties with South Korea, Japan, ASEAN states, and European partners. These governments value stable rules and long-term industrial planning. Joly's announcement positions Canada not as a sidekick to American manufacturing, but as a full participant in a wider economic bloc that includes Asia and Europe. What makes Joly's shift so remarkable is that it reflects a trend already taking place inside Canadian factories. The United States no longer anchors Canada's auto production. Companies from Japan and Korea now represent the majority of vehicles built in the country. European investment is accelerating. U.S. automakers, meanwhile, are shrinking their presence. This reverses decades of conventional wisdom that Canada must align with U.S. rules to protect its auto jobs. Today, the opposite is true. The more Canada depends on the United States, the more vulnerable it becomes to Trump's unpredictability. American tariffs may have been intended to pull manufacturing back into the U.S., but in practice, they pushed foreign and domestic automakers to deepen their Canadian footprint. Investors want stability, predictable rules, and access to global markets, all areas where Canada now offers more certainty than Washington. Joly's framing is blunt. Canada will invest in companies that invest in Canada. If the Detroit Three reduce their presence, Canada will diversify away from them. This approach signals confidence, not defensiveness, and it rebalances power in the relationship with the United States. Shifting to performance-based emission standards gives automakers the flexibility they have been asking for. It works for Canada's climate, geography, and market realities better than rigid EV quotas. It allows manufacturers to meet emissions goals through hydrogen, hybrids, advanced combustion engines, or fully electric platforms. Europe has already structured its transition around this model, which makes Canada's alignment both strategic and practical. This regulatory shift also positions Canada to attract global production platforms. When a company designs a next-generation vehicle, it wants to build where rules match major export markets. Canada's new alignment with Europe makes it an ideal base for engineering and production, especially for automakers already operating in Canada's integrated supply chain. The timing of the strategy is significant. The EV market across North America is fluctuating. Stellantis announced a massive financial hit tied to slowing EV demand. In the U.S., political divides continue to undermine long-term infrastructure planning and environmental rules. Canada, on the other hand, is stabilizing the transition with targeted rebates, billions in clean energy credits, and a national grid expansion designed to double capacity over the next decade. This is exactly the kind of long-term certainty investors seek. Canada's clean energy strategy is becoming a competitive advantage. With access to critical minerals like nickel, potash, and cobalt, and a power grid that is already over 80% clean, Canada offers the ingredients global automakers need for a reliable EV supply chain. The U.S. remains dependent on volatile political decisions and slower infrastructure rollout, giving Canada a clearer narrative to sell to investors. Trump's tariff policies were supposed to make America the industrial center of North America. Instead, they unintentionally strengthened Canada's alliances with Asia and Europe. Through APEC, G7 meetings, and Indo-Pacific engagements, Canada has quietly built a coalition of partners eager to collaborate on clean technology, supply chains, artificial intelligence, and defense procurement. South Korea's submarine bid, for example, is tied to industrial commitments. Japan is investing heavily in battery innovation. ASEAN nations are exploring long-term trade opportunities with Canada. These developments reveal the broader meaning of Joly's strategy. Canada is choosing a diversified industrial future that no longer assumes U.S. leadership or reliability. Joly's tone resonates with Canadian workers because it acknowledges a frustration many have felt for years. Canada's economic future should not be at the mercy of another country's political drama. Carney and Joly are presenting a narrative of strength and independence. Canada will shape its own rules. Canada will defend its own jobs, and Canada will choose partners who treat it as an equal, not as a subordinate in North American manufacturing. The reality is that foreign automakers see Canada as a stable destination where climate policy, clean energy, and industrial strategy are moving in the same direction. This is something the United States cannot guarantee right now. Canada's new auto strategy marks the beginning of a new industrial chapter. Instead of reacting to U.S. decisions, Canada is designing a system based on its own priorities, its own workers, and its own long-term interests. Trump's tariffs were meant to force Canada into compliance. Instead, they motivated Canada to stand taller, invest strategically, and build alliances that stretch far beyond North America. The question now is whether U.S. automakers understand what just happened. Canada is not waiting for Washington anymore, and for the first time in decades, the future of the North American auto industry may not be written in Detroit, but in Ottawa, Guelph, and St. Thomas.
This is Hanwha's KSS-3 submarine, launched into the sea just in time for the Prime Minister's visit. Mark Carney climbed down 7 meters to check out what the South Koreans want Canada to buy.
When you walk through the Hanwha Ocean Shipyard in South Korea, you can feel the weight of industry. Towering cranes, welding sparks, and steel hulls taking shape on the water. It is one of the largest shipyards in Asia, 5 square kilometers of pure precision and ambition. And in late October 2025, amid that metallic rhythm, one visitor stood out: Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. Cameras followed him as he toured the submarine line that could soon redefine Canada's Navy. Hanwha Ocean is one of 2 finalists competing to replace Canada's aging Victoria-class submarines. The South Koreans promised 12 new KS-3 boats, 4 by 2035, if a deal is signed by 2026. That single image, Carney standing among South Korean engineers, carried more meaning than a press statement ever could. While Donald Trump was in another city warning allies to buy American and tightening tariff walls, Carney was moving in the opposite direction. He was in Asia, exploring technology and partnerships the United States could no longer offer. For Canada, this wasn't just a defense procurement trip. It was a declaration of independence, an unmistakable signal that Ottawa is no longer waiting for Washington's permission to modernize.
The story behind Carney's visit runs deeper than submarines. It reflects a global realignment, now visible from Ottawa to Seoul. In recent years, South Korea has earned a new nickname, the Arsenal of Democracy. Once a nation rebuilt from the ashes of war, it is now on course to become the world's 4th largest weapons exporter. Korean firms have delivered artillery to Poland, tanks to Australia, and air defense systems to NATO allies. Now, they are bidding to build Canada's next fleet of submarines, a contract worth between 20 and 24 billion US dollars. What makes Seoul's offer so attractive is speed and partnership. The KS-3 submarines are already operational for the Korean Navy. They can be built within the next decade using advanced robotics and modular construction. The proposal even includes technology transfer, crew training, and the creation of maintenance facilities on Canadian soil. It's not a one-off transaction. Seoul's Deputy Defense Minister has called it a long-term partnership aimed at strengthening Canada's own defense industry. That approach stands in sharp contrast to traditional American deals, which often keep production and intellectual property inside the U.S. border. For Carney, the choice is symbolic. By engaging South Korea, Canada is signaling to the world and to Washington that it will not be confined to a single industrial orbit. It is building new supply chains and friendships in Asia, where technology and cooperation come without the constant shadow of tariffs and political strings. To understand why this moment matters, we need to look at what's happening on the other side of the Pacific. Since returning to the White House, President Trump has rebuilt his economic playbook around protectionism. Under the America First agenda, his administration has imposed sweeping import taxes ranging from 10 to 100%. Canada has been hit particularly hard, facing a 25% tariff on most industrial goods and an additional 10% on energy. For Ottawa, those measures have disrupted trade worth over $120 billion annually. Instead of retaliating, Carney's government chose a more strategic path. It began shifting Canada's defense and technology partnerships towards Asia, where nations like South Korea and Japan were eager to cooperate without political tension. That shift is not just economic. It's geopolitical. Every submarine Canada builds with Seoul, every maintenance contract it signs outside the U.S. is a quiet rebalance of power. It chips away at Washington's decades-long dominance over North American industry. In short, Trump's tariffs have accelerated exactly what he hoped to prevent: the diversification of Western allies away from U.S. factories. By pushing partners to the edge, the White House has forced them to find new routes, and Canada is proving that independence can be a strategy, not a risk.
It's hard to miss the symbolism. At the end of October, both Donald Trump and Mark Carney were in South Korea, but for entirely different missions. Trump met President Lee Jae-myung to finalize a $350 billion U.S.-Korea trade framework focused on reshoring and tight supply chain control. Carney, meanwhile, visited GOJ, where Korean engineers built submarines for their own navy. Two Western leaders, one country, two opposite visions. Trump came to enforce American terms, Carney came to forge new ones. One relied on tariffs, the other on trust. This contrast captures the fracture in today's Western order. The old model, Washington dictates, allies follow, is breaking apart. Canada's outreach to South Korea represents a new approach, where middle powers collaborate directly and trade capability, not obedience. As Trump's motorcade departed Seoul, Carney's team entered Hanwha's shipyard. For historians, it might mark the week Canada stopped orbiting Washington and started steering its own course in Asia.
A year ago, Canada seemed like a casualty of Trump's trade war. Tariffs on steel, autos, and lumber cut exports and threatened jobs. Economists warned of long-term damage. But by late 2025, the narrative has flipped. Instead of pleading for tariff relief, Canada is rebuilding through new alliances. Deals with Japan, South Korea, and Australia now anchor its industrial strategy. Partnerships that share technology instead of imposing restrictions. The submarine talks are more than procurement. They represent who controls the engines of innovation. If the deal goes through, it will bring thousands of jobs, advanced robotics training, and new supply chain opportunities inside Canada. More importantly, it proves that Canada can prosper outside America's shadow. Trump's tariffs tried to isolate Ottawa, but instead propelled it toward a network of Asian democracies eager for cooperation. Government officials expect the first submarines by 2035, the same year the USMCA review is due. By then, Canada's defense network could stretch from Vancouver to Busan, not just from Ottawa to Washington. The message is clear. While the US builds walls, Canada builds bridges. Partnership has replaced dependency. Strategy has replaced fear. And as the clang of steel echoed through Hanwha's shipyard, it symbolized something larger than a contract. The moment a nation reclaimed control of its industrial future.
From afar, it might look like an ordinary diplomatic visit. But in the global story of 2025, Carney's stop in South Korea speaks volumes. It shows that alliances are shifting and that middle powers like Canada can redefine their destiny without waiting for Washington. In a world dominated by tariffs and trade wars, this submarine project isn't just about ships under the sea, it's about a country surfacing with a new sense of confidence. Because while others build barriers, Canada is quietly forging steel, and with it, a new path forward.